Steve Brown, New York Times. Martin Shkreli, 34, has confidently courted controversy in recent years, bulldozing his way into Wall Street and the drug industry, raising the price of a life-saving drug by 5,000% overnight, boasting that he would outwit prosecutors in his federal fraud case, and live streaming and tweeting throughout his 5-week trial. But on Friday, after 5 days of deliberations, jurors convicted him on 3 counts of fraud in federal court, and he now faces up to 20 years in prison on each of the first 2 counts, and up to 5 years on the final count. Mr. Shkreli looked shaken as the judge read the verdict. But not long after, he appeared outside of court and returned to form, saying that he was delighted, in many ways, with the verdict. This was a witch hunt of epic proportions, and maybe they found 1 or 2 broomsticks, he said. Later in the afternoon, he was live streaming once more, sipping beer and joking about prison life from his Manhattan apartment. At the trial in the Federal District Court in Brooklyn, Mr. Shkreli was accused of securities and wire fraud related to 2 hedge funds he ran, MSMB Capital and MSMB Healthcare. Prosecutors charged he illegally used a pharmaceutical company he founded, Retrophin, to repay defrauded MSMB investors. And they said he secretly controlled a huge number of Retrophin shares. He never seemed to take his case seriously, meeting with federal authorities without a lawyer, making faces during testimony, calling the prosecution junior varsity and reading a book during final statements. Jurors convicted Mr. Shkreli of 3 of the 8 counts: securities fraud in connection with his hedge fund MSMB Capital, securities fraud in connection with MSMB Healthcare, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud related to the Retrophin stock scheme, in which he tried to quietly control a huge portion of Retrophin stock. He was acquitted of counts 1 and 2, conspiracy to commit securities fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud regarding MSMB Capital. Counts 4 and 5, the same charges with MSMB Healthcare, and count 7, conspiracy to commit wire fraud with regard to defrauding Retrophin by using funds from it to pay MSMB investors. Count 7 carried the most weight for sentencing, charging Mr. Shkreli with defrauding Retrophin by creating sham consulting agreements and unauthorized settlement agreements to pay back MSMB investors. It was associated with the biggest loss, which judges take into account when deciding sentences in fraud cases, said Benjamin Brafman, Mr. Shkreli's lawyer. As Judge Kyoei Matsumoto read the verdict, Mr. Shkreli, wearing a black polo shirt and khakis, sat with his arms crossed. He showed outward relief when Judge Matsumoto said he was not guilty on count 7, mouthing yes and patting Mr. Brafman on the back. When she said he was guilty of count 8, the Retrophin securities fraud conspiracy, he hung his head. After the verdict was read, he gathered in a circle with his lawyers, looking a little shaken, then pulled on a hoodie. By the time he got outside court, where he gave his statements, he was smiling and speaking smoothly. Bridget M. Road, the acting United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, the federal prosecutor's office in Brooklyn, said she was gratified by the verdict. Our work is not done. Mr. Shkreli remains to be sentenced, and there's a co-defendant in the case, she said, referring to Evan Griebel, Mr. Shkreli's one-time lawyer, who is scheduled to be tried in the fall. A sentencing date was not set. Judge Matsumoto said she would wait for submissions from both sides on how much money was lost. She set a fall date for those submissions. Mr. Brafman said the defense might ask for no prison time. Martin Shkreli, center, with his lawyers Mark Agnifilo, left, and Benjamin Brafman, right. After the verdict in his fraud trial in Brooklyn on Friday, Louis Lanzano for the New York Times jurors, who deliberated for 5 days and sent only one substantive note in that time, were never deadlocked, according to one juror, who spoke after the verdict on condition of anonymity because he said he did not want to be associated by name with the case. He described the deliberations as methodical and logical and said the jurors had focused on whether Mr. Shkreli had intended to harm investors who gave him money. The jury voted to convict on counts in which they saw fraudulent intent to take money, the juror said. At Mr. Shkreli's trial, prosecutors, defense lawyers and witnesses provided sharply different takes on the defendant as they described how he rose from an ambitious young hedge fund manager to a notorious pharmaceutical executive. The prosecution brought forth an avalanche of evidence, as the prosecutor Jacqueline Kasoulis put it in her rebuttal argument, that Mr. Shkreli illegally used Retrophin to repay the defrauded MSMB investors. The evidence included a threatening letter he sent to the wife of a former employee, statements he sent to MSMB investors showing great returns at the same time he had no money in fund accounts, 3 versions of a backdated agreement to make it look as if MSMB Capital had invested in Retrophin when it had not, and claims about assets under management that were wildly out of line with his actual fund size. It's time for Martin Shkreli to be held accountable, she said. His lawyers focused on the fact that his investors ultimately made back much more than their initial investments. They said that was proof that Mr. Shkreli had never intended to commit fraud. Instead, they said, he worked hard to get Retrofin off the ground so he could reimburse MSMB investors. He did it, and it worked, and they got paid, Mr. Brefman said in his closing statement. When they got the financing, they started to pay these people, not dilute Retrofin. However, prosecutors said that paying Mr. Shkreli's old investors was not the responsibility of Retrofin, a public company, and that Mr. Shkreli had misled his MSMB investors. Lying to people to get them to invest with you is fraud, Ms. Kasoulis said in her final statement. Mr. Shkreli is the child of Albanian immigrants. He was raised in Brooklyn, and attended Hunter College High School, one of the city's elite public schools. He went to Baruch, one of New York City colleges, and landed an internship at Kramer Berkowitz, going on to other money management jobs. As he recruited investors for his own funds, MSMB Capital and MSMB Healthcare, he was cunning at times, almost a shapeshifter. He told an investor who had not graduated from college that he had not finished college either, according to testimony. To an established Texas investor, he said he had graduated young from Columbia. He told another investor, in an email chain about Steve Jobs, a college dropout, that he had dropped out of Columbia. His lawyers painted him as an oddball who did not brush his teeth and slept in a sleeping bag at his office. Before the trial, Mr. Shkreli was perhaps best known for increasing the price on the drug Daraprim, which treats a parasitic infection, to $750 a tablet, from $13.50, when he was the chief executive of Turing Pharmaceuticals in 2015. The public and politicians vilified him for the price increase, and Mr. Shkreli responded by buying another drug and saying he would raise the price on that one, too. Documents entered into evidence throughout the trial showed Mr. Shkreli as devil-may-care. At one point, Mr. Griebel, Mr. Shkreli's co-defendant and former lawyer, wanted to have a phone call with him about an issue involving lawyer-client privilege, and Mr. Shkreli responded, "Not available by phone ever, sorry." During his post-verdict live-stream, Mr. Shkreli, sipping from a bottle of India Pale Ale, speculated that his sentence would be close to nil and said that he was not anticipating spending time in a maximum security facility, adding, "This is not Oz or The Wire." Rather, he said, he imagined serving in what he termed Club Fed, playing basketball, tennis and Xbox, and resurfacing back out on these streets very quickly. Correction: August 4, 2017. An earlier version of this article misstated Martin Shkreli's position as the verdict was read. He was sitting, not standing. The version of this article appears in print on August 5, 2017, on page A1 of the New York edition with the headline "Guilty of Fraud, Shkreli grins and shrugs it off."